Hi friend, happy to have you here. If this is your first visit, please subscribe and share the video. It really helps. Let me know your location in the comments. I read every message. Let's dive in. James and Emma began their journey together, filled with optimism, their hearts anchored in love and a steadfast conviction that nothing could ever drive them apart. In those early days, their lives were colored by deep conversations, spontaneous getaways, and mutual dreams of what was to come. Yet, gradually, the brightness dulled. Quietly, without fanfare, the monotony of everyday life seeped in. The evenings that once echoed with laughter and warmth slowly gave way to tension, disputes over money, obligations, and the fatigue of daily responsibilities. The love between them remained, but their attention shifted from nurturing their bond to simply getting through each day. Parenthood brought moments of happiness, but also an added layer of pressure. The time that had once been theirs alone was now swallowed up by chores, long work hours, and the endless needs of their children. Gone were the romantic dinners, the small but meaningful surprises that once marked their affection. Their relationship became mechanical, as though following a script rather than being lived. The closeness they had cherished felt like a memory from another life. They now functioned more like partners in a household operation than a couple in love. At first, James didn't recognize how far apart they had grown. He convinced himself they were just busy, that their connection would reignite when things slowed down. Emma, on the other hand, had begun to feel the emotional distance much sooner. Their conversations dwindled, and gestures of affection became infrequent and lacking in warmth. Over time, they drifted into a quiet resignation, where love no longer actively lived between them. The comforting looks and wordless support that once defined their bond had vanished, replaced by a silence that felt isolating instead of safe. The home that had once been their haven now felt like a space shared by strangers. James hadn't expected the pressures of life to erode something that had seemed so unshakable. But that's exactly what had happened. They were together in the same space, yet miles apart in every other way. As days turned into weeks, James clung to his routines, blind to the emotional unraveling that was steadily unfolding. To him, everything felt like it was on track. Work, bills, parenting, brief exchanges with Emma before sleep, and the quiet hope that things would go back to how they once were. He kept telling himself this was just a temporary rough patch, a phase they would soon move past. But Emma felt smothered by the silence between them. It wasn't about the absence of quality time anymore. It was the absence of true emotional presence. When she looked at James, she saw someone who was physically there, yet no longer part of her inner world. The intimate talks they once shared had dissolved into practical conversations, little more than coordination of household duties. And when the emotional gap finally became undeniable, James could no longer pretend he didn't see the cracks forming. Their home, once alive with affection, now echoed with a kind of emptiness. Even amidst the joyful chaos their children brought, something was missing. James began to understand, too late, that the issue wasn't their lack of time, but their lack of genuine connection. The evenings they once shared had devolved into silence, broken only by background noise or the dull rhythm of exhaustion pulling them to bed, side by side but entirely alone. One evening, coming home from work, James found Emma staring out the window, her expression distant. He sat beside her and tried to start a conversation, but her responses were short, detached, and cold. A chill crept through him. He understood then, at least in part, what he had been avoiding. Her faraway gaze and emotionless replies weren't random. They were signs that she was drifting away, no longer grounded in their shared life. For the first time in a long while, James truly examined the distance between them. He thought of the moments he had let pass by, the subtle warnings Emma had given him, the emotional cues he had ignored. He had believed their love was strong enough to weather anything, that it would survive regardless of how little attention he gave it. He realized how wrong he had been. Love doesn't endure on its own. It needs to be nurtured. And he had neglected it, slowly and silently, until there was barely anything left. The truth hit with force. While he had been buried in everyday concerns, their foundation had been cracking all along. And now, standing amid the emotional wreckage, he feared it was too late to repair what had been lost. All that remained was a faint trace of what they had once been. When reality finally sank in, James found himself in the very situation he had believed he was safe from. Years of growing apart had left their relationship fragile, and the final rupture came like a storm he never anticipated. Worn out from years of emotional neglect, Emma began seeking connection elsewhere. At first, James dismissed the hints, the extra phone calls, the unexplained absences, the growing coldness, as just another stage in their cycle. But this time, it wasn't just another phase. The truth revealed itself, sharp and unforgiving. Emma had started an affair with a co-worker, someone who gave her the emotional intimacy and excitement she no longer found at home. When she finally told him, her words were clear and resolute. She hadn't felt truly alive in their relationship for years, and she had found comfort in another's arms. James, stunned and devastated, watched the life he had taken for granted unravel in a matter of days. What once seemed like a distant, unthinkable possibility had gradually become an undeniable reality. Divorce was no longer an abstract fear, but a painful certainty. After nearly 20 years of shared life, their marriage collapsed with a finality that stunned them both. Emma had reached her decision, and there was no room left for negotiation. Her mind was made up. James, despite his quiet desperation, was helpless to alter the course she had set. They now sat across a table from one another, lawyers facilitating the dismantling of the life they'd built. Discussions of practicalities, money, housing, the children, took place while James drifted in silence, struggling to comprehend how their bond had come so completely undone. The trust that had once served as their foundation had crumbled beyond recovery. He couldn't escape the sense of betrayal, not only by Emma, but by his own failure to recognize how deeply things had deteriorated. Sleep eluded him. Nighttime became a torment of swirling grief, resentment, and relentless self-doubt. The same thoughts cycled endlessly in his mind. Where did I go wrong? Was there something I could have done? But no amount of introspection could reverse what had been lost. The marriage was over, and the emotional aftermath was immense. The love he had once embraced so fully now seemed like a mirage, and the future he had envisioned lay shattered. The woman who had once been his closest ally, his confidant, now felt like a stranger. Her final words echoed in his thoughts, and the image of her finding comfort in someone else's arms left a wound that refused to heal. Her betrayal was a deep, cutting blow, and moving forward felt nearly impossible. Yet amid the emotional devastation, practical concerns demanded attention. The task of dividing assets, untangling shared finances, and determining the fate of the home where their memories lived had to be confronted. But it wasn't the loss of possessions that haunted James most. It was the looming uncertainty about their children. How could he guide them through the unraveling of the only life they had known? How could he explain that the love that once held their family together had vanished? Those worries weighed on him constantly. This was more than just the dissolution of a marriage. It signaled the closure of an entire era of his life. He knew he had to rebuild, yet the road ahead was clouded with sorrow and anxiety. Once the divorce papers were signed, James was left grappling with a storm of emotions he couldn't seem to manage. Emma's affair wasn't just a betrayal of vows, it was a shattering of everything they had shared. The moments that used to warm his heart now felt distant and twisted by pain. That the woman he had built a life with had chosen to give her heart to someone else wasn't just hurtful, it was catastrophic. Trust became an obsession, something he found himself obsessively trying to analyze. He sifted through old conversations, dissected casual gestures, and replayed fleeting expressions, wondering if the truth had been visible all along. Had the emotional void he'd sensed in recent months been a signal he ignored? These questions haunted his quietest moments, tormenting him with every unanswered possibility. Now alone in a house made emptier by custody arrangements and silence, James's thoughts spiraled. It wasn't just Emma who now seemed unfamiliar. He found himself doubting everyone around him. Friends, co-workers, even passing acquaintances felt suspect. His belief in others, and in himself, had been deeply shaken. Emotionally laid bare, he had no idea how to piece himself back together. Those early post-divorce days were among the darkest he'd ever endured. He swung violently between rage and despair, unable to anchor himself. Anger surged when he thought about the lies, the broken commitments, the manipulation. But grief always returned. Grief for the laughter they once shared, for the anniversaries and quiet nights that had felt so safe. Emma's unfaithfulness hadn't only broken their relationship, it shattered his emotional core. It blurred the line between memory and pain and shook his confidence in his own instincts. The certainty that had once defined his character was now replaced by a fog of doubt. He kept revisiting their past, analyzing choices, wondering if he had somehow caused their downfall. Had he failed her? Could he have done more? That guilt was only deepened by the presence of their children. He tried his best to protect them from his heartache, but some days, the burden became too much to hide. Even simple acts of love from his kids stirred an ache in him, one laced with guilt and fear. Did they feel the same loss he did? Could they sense the emotional wreckage beneath his composed exterior? James tried to embody strength, to be the father they needed, but the strain of betrayal made it harder with each passing day. Every morning brought a new emotional battle. He knew deep down that healing would eventually require him to rediscover trust, not just in others, but in himself. Yet in those early days, the idea of recovery seemed like a dim and distant light flickering through a thick, impenetrable haze. The days began to blur, each one a quiet, grinding struggle to find meaning in the midst of the chaos. Though the legal part of their separation had been finalized, fresh complications continued to emerge, particularly around custody and co-parenting. James had always believed that, despite everything, he and Emma would remain united in prioritizing their children's well-being. He clung to that hope. But reality quickly grew more tangled than he had imagined. Emma, who had once agreed to share parenting equally, began pushing for more time with the kids. She insisted that her role as their mother gave her a deeper claim on their attention. To James, this felt like yet another betrayal. He had never been distant or uninvolved. He had shown up, stayed present, loved fiercely. Watching her now try to edge him out of their children's lives ignited a fear he couldn't shake. This wasn't just about custody schedules or legal boundaries. It was about the sacred bond he shared with his children. It was about the sense of purpose that tethered him to something still whole. Her demands didn't feel like negotiations. They felt like threats to the one thing he had left that still felt real. James hadn't expected the custody case to stretch on for as long as it did. What he thought might be resolved quickly turned into an exhausting series of legal appointments, emotionally charged courtroom appearances, and an ever-deepening rift between him and Emma. The air between them grew heavy with animosity, and even though their children were still quite young, they could feel the emotional tension that wrapped itself around the family. James did his best to shield them from the turmoil he carried, but the stress of his exchanges with Emma inevitably surfaced, no matter how hard he tried to mask it. And custody wasn't the only front where battles were being waged. What had once been a shared financial life began to reveal secrets as the division of their assets got underway. James found himself blindsided by a wave of financial disclosures, debts Emma had never spoken of during their marriage. Unpaid credit cards, undisclosed personal loans, and excessive expenditures began to emerge. each revelation more staggering than the last. What unsettled him most, however, was the discovery of a private circle Emma had been part of, a group engrossed in extravagant outings and indulgences, all bankrolled by money he never knew was disappearing. The scope of her hidden spending left him reeling. As if the emotional fallout of the separation and the complexity of custody negotiations weren't enough, James now faced a full-blown financial emergency. The savings he had carefully built, meant to provide a secure foundation for his children's future, now seemed dangerously unstable. With no choice but to confront the full extent of the damage, James enlisted the help of attorneys and financial experts, embarking on a difficult reevaluation of everything he thought he understood about their finances. The betrayal he had felt from her infidelity now extended beyond the personal. It had endangered their children's well-being. Standing at the intersection of grief and duty, James had to face a sobering question. How could he begin again when he was still entangled in the mess Emma had left behind? The journey toward financial stability was grueling. He had to renegotiate agreements, sell off assets, and make painful compromises just to protect what remained for his kids. No matter how bitter their relationship had become, James refused to let his children suffer because of it. In the middle of all the heartbreak, something inside him softened. He felt a flicker of hope, an idea that perhaps, if not as partners, they might still find a way to function as co-parents. He reached out to Emma for one final attempt at unity, not out of longing, but out of a desire to offer their children something steady amidst the upheaval. He hoped there might still be a shred of the connection they once shared, something they could draw from to build a foundation of cooperation. With that hope, they agreed to meet in a quiet cafe, away from anyone they knew. James arrived carrying a mixture of trepidation and cautious optimism, willing to hear her out, ready to be open if it meant closure. But the Emma who sat across from him hadn't changed. Her voice held the same well-worn explanations, the same vague attempts to justify her actions. She talked as though her choices had been insignificant missteps rather than calculated decisions that had lasting consequences. It quickly became evident that she hadn't come to take responsibility. She hadn't come to make amends. Instead, she evaded the truth. She brushed things off. She subtly redirected blame, even implying that James bore some of the fault for how things fell apart. The conversation, which he had approached with a fragile sense of hope, began to feel like a repeat performance, a carefully rehearsed denial of reality. The dishonesty lingered. The familiar patterns emerged. The evasions and excuses hadn't gone anywhere. As the exchange unfolded, whatever hope James had left slowly dissipated. Reconciliation, he realized, was no longer possible. Whatever trust or admiration had once existed between them had crumbled beyond repair. Emma's ongoing pursuit of escapism, her refusal to engage emotionally, weren't isolated mistakes. They were repeated decisions she had made despite knowing the cost. James left the cafe not with a sense of peace, but with unshakable clarity. There was nothing left to salvage. The idea of rebuilding trust or reestablishing family unity was a fantasy. That conversation didn't heal anything, but it stripped away the last illusions he had been holding on to. The woman he once loved was gone, and she wasn't coming back. And more importantly, he didn't need to keep chasing a future with her in it. From that day forward, James resolved to stop looking behind him. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with emotional healing that could take years, or may never be complete. But what he understood now with quiet certainty was that peace would not be found in what had already fallen apart. Emma had made choices that placed her on an entirely different path. She no longer belonged in the future he was trying to create. Even after all the betrayals, the courtroom struggles, and the heartbreak, James never imagined he'd be able to love again. The divorce had torn open wounds he didn't know he had, leaving him uncertain if those scars would ever fade. The idea of building something new, rooted in trust and stability, had once seemed unreachable. He still didn't know what the future held, But he finally understood what it wouldn't include, and that, at last, was enough to take the first step forward. As life often does, it veered in a direction no one could have foreseen. Several years had passed since the divorce when James met Sophie, introduced through friends. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, calm, compassionate, and exuding a quiet resilience that became evident in every conversation. At first, James hesitated to explore a romantic connection. The scars from his past and the fear of vulnerability still weighed heavily on him. But over time, Sophie gently demonstrated that love didn't always lead to heartbreak. She offered him a new perspective, that affection could heal rather than hurt. Their relationship unfolded slowly, without pressure or urgency, allowing James to rediscover trust, to open up once more, and to appreciate the beauty of sharing everyday life with someone he cared for. Where Emma had often withheld her feelings, Sophie was always direct and sincere. She listened intently, invited honest dialogue, and created a space where James felt emotionally safe, something he hadn't experienced in years. What started as a simple, sincere friendship gradually deepened into something profoundly meaningful. Once convinced that love was a closed chapter in his life, James began to realize that real connection wasn't about flawlessness, but about truth and presence. With Sophie's compassion and patient understanding, he was able to confront the lingering pain of his previous marriage without feeling rushed or judged. In time, their bond led them to a shared decision. They would marry, not to recapture something lost, but to build something wholly new, forged from growth and the hard-won wisdom of experience. Sophie never overstepped his emotional boundaries. She acknowledged the hurt he carried and met it with kindness, not pressure. Together, they built a foundation based on mutual respect and clear understanding. Their wedding was simple and intimate, attended only by those closest to them. It lacked the elaborate trappings of his wedding to Emma, but this time, James wasn't searching for spectacle, only sincerity and closeness. His children, now grown, stood by him without hesitation. They were genuinely happy to see their father find joy again. This second marriage didn't just bring companionship. It gave James a revitalized sense of purpose and belief in the future. The memories of Emma remained, but they no longer controlled him. That chapter had come to a peaceful close. Sophie brought the emotional steadiness he had long craved. Together, they created a life filled with meaningful moments and mutual support. Against the odds, James had emerged from heartbreak and rediscovered love. More importantly, he learned that the pain of the past doesn't have to determine the path ahead. At last, he could begin again, no longer burdened by the emotional weight he once carried. Years later, during a quiet evening with Sophie, James reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He recognized how far he had come, from a man fractured by betrayal to someone calmer, wiser, and comfortable in his own skin. Though the wounds hadn't vanished, they no longer defined him. Those experiences had become a part of his story, etched in memory, but no longer dictating his direction. His relationship with Emma had changed him profoundly, not just in heart, but in how he understood love, commitment, and himself. For a long time, he questioned whether he could have saved their marriage, but with time came clarity. Not all endings are failures. Some are simply the beginning of something new. The painful process of letting go had gifted him with insight he might never have gained otherwise. Chief among these was a newfound appreciation for love and trust. These things must be cultivated, not assumed. James came to see how complacency had slowly eroded his bond with Emma, how he once believed their connection was immune to wear. Now he understood differently. Love required presence, effort, and continual investment. What he had once overlooked, he now offered freely to Sophie, who remained by his side with grace and steadiness. Another truth he came to embrace was the power of human resilience. He had endured one of the darkest chapters of his life, and even in moments of despair, he kept going. The pain was real, the challenges immense, but he refused to surrender. Though Emma's betrayal broke him, it also shaped him into someone stronger, more compassionate. Looking back, James could finally say with certainty that he had made it through. His journey proved that even when life unravels, one can gather the pieces and build anew. In time, he found a peace he had once believed unreachable. His interactions with Emma had diminished to only what was necessary for co-parenting. Though faint echoes of the past still lingered, they no longer held him back. Emma had moved on, and so had he. His life with Sophie was one of shared values, deep trust, and enduring love, a life that felt genuinely renewed. James often reflected on his children. He had always worried about how the divorce would affect them, but through steady love and presence, he managed to preserve their sense of security. They grew up surrounded by care and stability, and he took quiet comfort in knowing he had protected them from the worst of the emotional turbulence. Now, when he looked at them, he felt a quiet pride. He had remained a devoted father, even during the hardest days. As his story continued to unfold, James embraced a deeper understanding. Life is shaped by acceptance, movement, and growth. He released the weight of his past and stepped into the future with openness and hope. The road he had traveled wasn't easy. It was marked by heartache, introspection, and healing, but each step brought him closer to the life he was meant to lead, one of contentment, authenticity, and peace.